Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to the front lines of Petersburg, Virginia on July 30th, 1864. 4 weeks during that hot, sultry southern summer, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants of the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry had supervised the digging of a long mine shaft from the Union lines underground and beneath the Confederate trenches on the opposite side. The detonation of 320 kegs of gunpowder at the end of that shaft on July 30th resulted in a massive hole in the middle of the Confederate defenses. It measured about 170 feet long, 100 to 120 feet wide, and about 30 feet deep at its deepest spot. You can see the view of the battle that ensued. This is a war illustration by artist Alfred Wood. If you look closely in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a little bit of an exaggeration, a lot of an exaggeration. Look at the big shoe or the big brogan, the sole of the brogan on the foot of the infantryman in the closest part of the foreground of the illustration. Is this some sort of a political comment about soldiers going into battle into the crater? I don't know, but the rest of the illustration is considered to be an accurate depiction of what unfolded that day. What appeared to be a golden opportunity for the U.S. Army turned out to be an inferno of carnage and death when botched orders led to the slaughter of many men, including black soldiers of the U.S. colored infantry who were trapped inside the crater. The explosion of the mine and the subsequent battle of the crater cost the Union Army about 4,000 casualties, and the victorious Confederates suffered as well about 1,500 casualties, including 278 South Carolinians who were killed outright by the blast. I want to share two perspectives from the battle, one Union and another Confederate. First, the Union. This is a letter by an unidentified soldier from the 32nd Maine Infantry, written a day after the fight. In it, he describes the heroism of the regiment as they attempted to assault the position. You'll hear mention of Colonel and Commander Mark Fernald Wentworth, life dates 1820 to 1897, who was wounded, and two officers from Company D, Captain Joseph Baker Hammond, life dates 1825 to 1905, and Second Lieutenant James J. Chase, life dates 1847 to 1918. Chase suffered a gunshot wound to his head, as you'll hear in a moment, that his comrades feared fatal. He survived, but he was permanently blinded. So here we go. The letter, as it appeared, is titled Letter from a Maine Soldier, Camp near Petersburg, Virginia, July 31st, 1864. We had the saddest day yesterday I ever saw. We were called up at 2:30 a.m. and formed in line of battle at 3. We filed our left and front and marched down to within 300 yards of the rebel fort we had mined and halted in a deep railroad cut until the explosion took place, which was terrific. There was 6 tons of powder buried 30 feet underground directly under the fort, which exploded at 4:30 a.m. when we started for the rebels and went directly into the remains of the fort. At the moment the fort blew up, we had 50 pieces of artillery open on them directly over us. The air was so thick I could not see 3 feet ahead. The ruins of the fort I cannot describe. My heart sickens at the thought. The huge masses of earth, thrown all the way from 6 to 10 rods, were thrown almost to our lines, or from the fort, 20 or 30 rods, and many of them were buried alive. Cannon and gun carriages thrown in all directions, together with the same inside, Where those two regiments met their fate, the South Carolinians, baffles description. The rebels opened on us right and left as soon as they could gather their senses. Our brigade made the charge so that we were some of the first ones in the fort. Many a poor fellow gave up his life, for it was a perfect torrent of shot and shell. Going over the parapet, we found a hole in the earth about 30 feet deep, large enough to hold from 4,000 to 6,000 men, packed full of our men, perfectly safe. The men knew it was almost certain death to get upon the parapet, but soon Colonel Wentworth, with a few others, went ahead, and our brigade followed. There is where the colonel got his wounds. When we got in, our regiment was one of the first. There were but two colors that I saw planted there, the 31st and the 32nd Maine. We could find no one to hold the colors, so Lieutenant Chase mounted the fort and held the colors when no other one would, but brave almost to rashness. After daring to leave the flag without holding it, he called for the men to load their guns and pass them to him, and he would stand and take deliberate aim. He continued to fire as long as it was of any use, and then he stepped back into the fort and was soon shot in his head. The first thing he said was, "Take me to Captain Hammond." They called me to him, and he would not consent for me to leave him, for he thought he should die, and we all thought he would, for he bled very badly. There was every probability that we should all be killed if we left the pit, but we soon started with him, myself, the orderly sergeant, and one from another company. It was so hot, we were almost exhausted as we had to carry him stooping so we should not get our heads shot off. We got almost to our lines before we got any help. When we got him on the ambulance, I broke down and could not stand. So there's the letter from the unknown Union soldier in the 32nd Maine Infantry, so broken down by events that he collapsed when it was all over. Now, here's the Confederate account, and this comes to us from George Michael Neese, life dates 1839 to 1921, of Chew's Battery of Horse Artillery, Stewart's Horse Artillery. His account was published in his 1911 book titled 3 Years in the Confederate Horse Artillery. It's focused on the U.S. colored troops, and it reveals Neese's feelings about the federal government, emancipation, and freedom. It's political. And here's Neese's view of the fight and the colored troops that were there. Neese begins, "After the explosion of the Yankee infantry, they attempted to charge through the yawning breach, but they were met by our infantry and greeted with a storm of shell from General Lee's batteries. A regular fierce battle ensued, in which the charging Yankees were shot down by the hundred. From all accounts, it was a regular slaughter pen, and the crater of their homemade volcano became the threshold of death to hundreds of Union soldiers. There was one division of colored troops in the charging column, and when they rushed and crowded into the extinct volcano and deathtrap, our infantry slaughtered them fearfully at a wholesale schedule rate. I do not know whether the colored troops were former slaves or not, but I suppose that the survivors are deeply impressed with the striking idea that the road to freedom's blissful goal lies through a blasted, deadly hole. I do wonder what the gentle, sympathetical, and philanthropical Aunt Harriet Beecher Stowe thinks of this sort of emancipation, of striking off the shackle of bondage one day and the next march the dear creatures into a hole and have them shot down by the hundred. Poor Uncle Tom. But the dear old lady ought to be perfectly satisfied and gratified, for the great butchery today was the effect of a grand and glorious Yankee invention for transferring the Uncle Toms from slavery and the fields of yellow corn to the blissful realms of freedom by making angels out of them in bunches of 500 at a time. I do not pretend to guess what the enemy expected to accomplish by their volcanic fireworks, but the whole affair was a sort of brutal monster, a hybrid between a blunder and a boomerang. For I heard that the Yanks lost about 4,000 men in the little experiment. So there you've got two very different perspectives of the battle, one from an infantryman from Maine and the other, an artilleryman from Virginia. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.